Rebel Wilson took advantage of lockdown and did the exact opposite of what I did. She exercised and got into shape. Now she's showing off her new look and her energy in the new Netflix comedy Senior Year. Will you be watching? And more importantly, should you? After a high school cheerleader falls off a pyramid and into a coma, she awakens 20 years later in the body of a 37-year-old woman. But having only aged physically and knowing nothing else, she returns to reclaim her seat at the popular table and win the prom queen crown that has eluded her. Rebel Wilson stars as Stephanie, the girl who wakes up from her coma, in this fish out of water going back to high school comedy. Now, if you saw the trailer, you probably got the feeling like you've seen this sort of movie before. And that's because you have. Wilson is basically playing a version of her Pitch Perfect character Fat Amy, but then smashing it together with Drew Barrymore's Josie Grossi from Never Been Kissed. Now, if you throw in a bit of Mean Girls, Bring It On, and basically any other random teen high school movie, all those together give you Senior Year. This has a rather large cast with the younger actors as well as the adult actors. We have Sam Richardson, Angourie Rice, Mary Holland, Zoe Zhao, Justin Hartley, Michael Cimino, Molly Brown, and Chris Parnell. Now, because this is billed as a comedy, I did expect to at least be amused. And there are several times where I was, but the majority of the time, the jokes just felt very forced. Plus, there are a ton of late 90s references that are smashed into modern day, like the story's trying to make fetch happen. Now, a lot of the story is actually very sad, where we see several characters chasing the past, and they don't even want to get out from being stuck there. And many of those characters, they're terrible people as well. They're cringy, horrible to each other, and they try to force their fake charisma on us. And it's unfortunate that they become so off-putting because I do think that there are some great character moments that could have really been pushed forward in the narrative, but they kept being held at bay in order to make some unfunny joke. Because Wilson's character Stephanie has been out of commission for 20 years, a ton of things have changed. Clothing, technology, and terminology. Now, unfortunately, these are all very obvious tropes to address and exploit for the comedic purposes, making them just very tired instead of inspiring or novel. Normally, I think we'd look down on characters who are in an arrested development sort of state, those that are just stuck in the past. But with Stephanie, we can forgive a bunch of that because she's truly missing 2 full decades of experiences. She has the body of an adult, but her mindset is still that of a teenager. Now, I would have loved to have the story dive more into that angle. Even if it had to get serious for a bit, that would invest me in the story and the character so much more if I could feel and understand her plight. What we get is just a shallow overview of someone who's desperately wanting to get back what they think they lost. Now, Rebel Wilson is fine for what she's doing, but I think the director didn't do a good enough job at helping her to create something new instead of riffing off moves and behaviors of her previous roles. I really enjoyed both Mary Holland's Martha and Sam Richardson's Seth. They play the adult versions of Stephanie's high school friends, and while they're both very quirky, they have wisdom and compassion to share with Stephanie. And they're very likable characters, and they become sort of the bright spots in this. Some of the filming looks good, and there are sequences that have some great cinematography. And the dance choreography is also well crafted, especially in a couple of scenes that start out as normal and then become sort of this fantasy music video thingy. I especially enjoyed how those segments cut back and forth between the character's vision of how things were playing out and then reality, showing us how ridiculous some of their actions really looked. The story is really just too long for what it is. It's just short of 2 hours, and that's about 20 minutes too much. The pacing isn't really the issue, it's just that they've included some scenes that bog down the narrative. I think some of the scenes go on entirely too long because after a point, they're not progressing the narrative, just really indulging themselves in whatever is happening in front of the camera. Now, the main source of conflict in this story comes from Stephanie and her high school rival, Tiffany. Now, this supposed squabble has carried over into adult life, even though Stephanie hasn't even been part of adult life for 2 decades. I'd love to say how their dynamic is wildly blown out of proportion, and grown adults don't act as petty and immature as they do. But I've been on social media, and it's horrifying at how accurately these characters capture some people. Now, the one true bright spot this had was at the end. And no, not when the credits rolled, but there was a genuine heartfelt moment where we get to see some change in our characters. But that being said, when there was a good character moment that showed some emotion, it was then sidelined by juvenile humor, like the movie just couldn't keep itself under control, even in the briefest of times, to have one mature moment. So overall, Senior Year relies mainly on rehashing ideas from other teen-themed movies without finding its own voice to make it unique. Rebel Wilson basically plays her character as a combo of her other roles, and when that's combined with a lot of forced humor, most of this feels like a chore to endure. There are some wonderful story moments that begin to emerge, but for some reason, they're smashed back down, maybe in fear of the story getting too serious or deep. But the depth actually would have made the story better by giving us a true reason to care about the characters. The tired and overused tropes of arrested development and living in the past to chase dreams that never came to fruition, they're extremely blatant in this movie, preventing the needed growth of characters to create something engaging and memorable. None of the acting is really bad, and the story itself didn't make me want to rip my eyes out. But because of the unoriginality of the plot and its execution, it all left me wanting and ultimately disappointed. There's no sex, but there's a ton of sexual dialogue and innuendo. There's no nudity, a lot of profanity, not really any violence. I give Senior Year 2 out of 5 couches. So what's a good Arrested Development movie that you've seen? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this review, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. I'm Chris. This is Movies and Munchies. Thanks for couching with me.